He never told his son he was proud of him. Not once. Not out loud. At the funeral, his son stood up and said he spent his whole life wondering. His father had been wondering the same thing, whether he needed to say it. He did. He always did.
I'm Ashley, and that story, which is real, and which Ryan told me before we started recording, I've been sitting with it since. It's heavy.
I'm Ryan, and this is Honestly English, where real conversations about life and human behavior are also, quietly, a masterclass in how high-status people communicate. Today, we are talking about saying what you mean before it is too late, specifically why the people who are most capable of it are often the least likely to do it.
We are going to get into the psychology of why high achievers struggle most with verbal emotional expression. Ryan has a framework for that, which genuinely reframed something I thought I understood.
We will also walk through the 3 sentences most people at this stage of life have never said out loud, and what it costs to keep not saying them.
I want to say there is something I almost did not include today, a specific conversation I have been avoiding for about 3 years. I might actually talk about it. We'll see.
When I was maybe 14, my father was driving me home from a baseball game where I had pitched a shutout, which for a 14-year-old is not a small thing, and we drove the whole way in silence. Not an uncomfortable silence, his version of comfortable. He gripped the wheel, nodded twice, and that was it. And I remember thinking, I think he's proud. I'm pretty sure, but I don't actually know.
And you were trying to read it.
Constantly, for years. And here's what's interesting about that. It wasn't that my father was cold or withholding or emotionally stunted. He was deeply intentional in other ways. He showed up, he worked hard, he sacrificed, he communicated love through action with extraordinary consistency. And yet, the unspoken words created a kind of ambient uncertainty that no amount of presence could fully dissolve. Because silence, at the level of emotional communication, is never neutral.
That is the thing people don't understand about silence. We think of it as the absence of something, but it isn't. It is an active presence. The person receiving it fills it, and they almost always fill it with their worst fear.
Exactly. And this is where the psychology becomes very specific. There is a well-documented pattern, and I want to be precise here, where individuals with high achievement profiles, people who have built authority, competence, and status across long careers, show a statistically significant difficulty with direct verbal emotional expression. Not because they don't feel it, because they've built an entire identity architecture around demonstrating value through output rather than voice.
Say that again differently, because I want to make sure I'm following.
The high achiever has spent 40 years learning that what you do is what you are. You communicate worth by building things, solving problems, showing up with answers. Words that don't solve a problem, words that are purely expressive, purely emotional, feel at some deep structural level like a misallocation of energy, like indulgence.
That is exactly what it is, isn't it? My father used to say, and I'm sure many people recognize this, "You know how I feel," as if saying it were somehow redundant, inefficient.
And that phrase, "you know how I feel," is a fascinating piece of identity foreclosure. It forecloses the possibility that the other person does not, in fact, know. It assumes the emotional transmission was complete, when in reality, it never left the sender.
Because the sender thinks they communicated it. The action, the sacrifice, the presence, the check written, the favor done, that was the message. But the receiver is waiting for the words.
And here is where the cost accumulates, not in a single moment, not at the funeral, though that is where it becomes visible. It accumulates daily, across decades, in the form of a very particular kind of relational ambiguity. The child, the spouse, the sibling, they build their self-understanding partly on the scaffolding of what they have been told. And if the person who mattered most never told them directly, clearly, deliberately, with their actual voice, there is a gap in that structure. And people spend entire lives filling that gap with speculation.
Which is its own kind of grief, a very quiet one.
It is. And what makes it so specific to the third act is the question of legacy, because at this stage, when you start thinking about what you leave behind, what your life meant, how you will be remembered, you realize that the legacy is not the house you paid off or the business you built. The legacy is the narrative coherence other people carry about who you were to them. And you have more authority over that narrative than you probably have exercised.
I had never thought about it as a strategic tool. That sounds cold, but I don't mean it that way. I mean, when Ryan first put it to me like that, I thought, oh, this isn't just about being emotionally open. This is about deliberately authoring the story your people carry.
That is exactly right. And the word I want to use is intentional. Because the people who are worst at this are not unfeeling. They are people who have been extraordinarily intentional about almost everything else in their lives. They have been intentional about their careers, their finances, their health, and somehow, in the domain of direct verbal expression, particularly with the people who matter most, they have operated on autopilot, on the inherited assumption that love transmitted through action is love received.
And sometimes it is. But it's never enough on its own.
It is never sufficient. And here is the analogy that clarified this for me. Imagine you spent 30 years building a library for someone, every book carefully chosen, every shelf perfectly organized. The architecture is extraordinary. It communicates who you are, what you value, what you hoped for them. And then one day they come to you and ask, "Did you build this for me?" And you say, "Isn't it obvious?" The library is still beautiful, the love is still real, but the question deserved a direct answer, because without the direct answer, they're not sure whether the library was for them or whether they happened to live nearby.
That is exactly the feeling. Was this for me or did I just happen to benefit?
And here's the thing about that kind of doubt. It does not dissolve with more action. It only dissolves with a clear, deliberate, spoken answer, which is why the work at this stage is not to do more. It is to say what you mean, clearly, out loud, to the specific people who need to hear it from your specific voice.
And there are 3 sentences, Ryan and I talked about this before the episode, 3 sentences that a remarkable number of people at this stage of life have never said out loud, not in the way they need to be said, with directness, with eye contact, without hedging.
The first one is simply, "I am proud of you." Not implied, not bundled into a gift or a favor or a recommendation, said, directly, named.
The second one, and this one is harder for a lot of people, is "I was wrong and I am sorry." Not "I'm sorry if you were hurt," or "we both could have handled it better." "I was wrong, I am sorry."
Those two require very different things from the speaker. The first requires vulnerability. The second requires something that looks a lot like epistemic humility, the willingness to revise your own narrative, to say, the story I've been telling about that moment is not the complete story.
And the third one is?
The third one is the most important, and for many people the hardest, which is simply, "I love you, and here is why." Not just "I love you," which has become through overuse almost semantic wallpaper, but the specific articulation of what you see in that person, what they have meant, what the world looks like because they are in it. That level of specificity and intentional verbal clarity is what makes it land.
Because the specificity is what makes it real. Anyone can say "I love you." The person who says, "I love you and I love the way you still laugh at the same things you laughed at when you were 7, that person has seen you. That's the sentence that lasts.
And I think the deepest cost of leaving these sentences unspoken, the deepest cost is not to the relationship, it's to your own narrative coherence. Because at some point the window closes, and the sentence that could have been said becomes a weight that cannot be put down, a version of grief that has no object, because the object is a thing that never happened.
And that is the part I think about most. The grief of the unsaid, because it belongs to both people, the one who didn't say it and the one who never heard it.
So let's get to the actual work, because I think one of the failure modes here is that people hear the argument, they feel it, they accept it, and then they return to their life and nothing changes. Not because they don't want to act, because they don't know how to begin. So let's make this concrete.
The first thing I'd say, and this is something I had to learn the hard way, is to stop waiting for the perfect moment. Because the perfect moment is a construction. It is a cognitive out. There is no perfect moment to say a difficult true thing. There is only the moment you decide to say it.
And the mechanism behind that waiting is loss aversion. The brain calculates the risk of saying the vulnerable thing, possible rejection, awkwardness, emotional exposure, and weighs it against the comfort of the status quo. The status quo always wins that calculation in the short term, which is why you have to short-circuit the calculation entirely.
What worked for me, and I'll be honest, I'm thinking of a specific conversation I had with my sister 2 years ago that I had been avoiding for about 4, was writing it first. Not to send, just to write. Because writing forces you to locate the exact words. You can't hide behind approximation on a page the way you can in your head.
That is the act of deliberately forcing clarity. You make yourself say the thing precisely enough to put it in a sentence. And once you have done that, the gap between the sentence on the page and the sentence in the air becomes much smaller. You've already done the hardest cognitive work.
Right. The terror is in finding the words. Once you have found them, the saying is almost easy. Almost.
The second thing, and this one I think is underestimated, is to communicate deliberately in writing when the face-to-face feels impossible. Not a text, not an emoji, a letter, an email where you give it real space. Because some things need the formality of a written form to carry their full weight. I have had conversations with grown men who said the only reason they knew their father was proud of them was because of a single card written at retirement. A card, 4 sentences, and those 4 sentences became the most authoritative document in that person's life.
That is such a powerful image. A document. Because that's what it becomes, doesn't it? It lives somewhere. It can be returned to. There's something about the written word that says, this was deliberate. I thought about this. This was not a moment of weakness.
If this kind of conversation is landing for you today, honestly, that's exactly what we're here for. Subscribe so you never miss one. We're here every Monday, Wednesday, and Friday, and we go this deep every time.
The third thing, and Ryan, I know you have something to add to this, is to lead with clarity, not with emotion. I think people assume that an emotionally significant conversation requires a big emotional buildup. It doesn't. In fact, the buildup often frightens the other person before the content arrives. The most powerful openings are almost quiet. I want to tell you something I should have said a long time ago. That's it. That's the sentence. Clear, direct, without alarm.
It does 2 things simultaneously. It signals that what follows is intentional. This is not a reactive outburst, not a crisis. It was thought about, and it gives the other person a half-second to arrive, to be present for what comes next. Because if you lead with the vulnerable thing itself, without that frame, the other person's nervous system often closes before they've heard you. A single sentence of deliberate authority opens the door before you walk through it.
Which is itself a kind of high-status communication skill, the ability to hold the space before you fill it.
The fourth thing, and I think this is specific to the third act, to people who have spent decades in authority, is to resist the pull toward what I'd call legacy performance, which is when the attempt to say the meaningful thing becomes subtly about the speaker's need to be seen as someone who said the meaningful thing. The other person can feel that distinction instantly.
They can. The sentence that is about the other person lands completely differently than the sentence that is quietly about your own absolution. And I don't say that to be harsh. It's a very human pull. But it is worth asking yourself before you open your mouth, is this for them or is this for me?
And the honest answer is often both, which is fine. But the framing of the conversation should lead with them. Start with what you see in them, what they have meant to you, not with what you regret about yourself.
The fifth one, and this might be the most practical of all, is simply this.
Do not end the conversation before it starts by rehearsing the other person's reaction. Because we do this, we play out the scenario in advance. We imagine the awkwardness or the tears or the dismissal. We decide how they will respond before they've had the chance to respond. And then we protect ourselves from a reaction that hasn't happened yet by not having the conversation at all.
And the thing about that particular cognitive pattern is that it is almost always wrong. The actual conversation, in my experience, and I think in most people's experience, is almost never as difficult as the imagined version. Because the imagined version is constructed entirely from your own anxiety. The real person is not made of your anxiety. They are made of their own longing to be known.
Which is usually the same longing you have. You just happen to be the one with the words.
So our question for you today is there someone in your life who does not know, not because you do not feel it, but because you have never built the moment to say it out loud?
For me, yes. And I teased this earlier, so I should actually say it. There is a person in my life who I think has spent years wondering whether I truly respect and admire what they built. Not just love them, but see the specific thing they gave their life to. And I've told myself it's understood, that they know. But sitting here having this conversation, I'm not sure they do. And that is something I'm going to fix this week. Not someday. This week.
Mine is my father. And I'll say it simply. I have become much better at this than he was because I watched the cost of it, but I have not always been as direct as I could be in the other direction, telling him what he gave me, not despite the silence, through it, that he taught me by the silence to listen so carefully that eventually I learned to hear what words were underneath. And I have never said that to him in those terms with that kind of deliberate clarity. I will.
Tell us your answer in the comments. We read every one.
If today helped you, share it with someone who needs it. New episodes every Monday, Wednesday, and Friday. See you in the next one.
The words you keep inside don't protect anyone. They just leave the people you love doing the translation work alone.